my daughter thought I had become nothing more than dead weight in her perfect suburban life. She whispered to her husband about my limitations and rolled her eyes when I moved too slowly through their gleaming kitchen. Then one morning she looked me straight in the eye and called me exactly what she thought I was, a burden. But what she didn't know was that the house she was so eager to push me out of, I still owned it. And when she came home that evening, she found eviction papers taped to the front door with her name on them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Henderson, and at 71 years old, I never imagined I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office discussing how to legally remove my own daughter from the home I'd worked 3 decades to pay off. But life has a way of teaching you lessons you never wanted to learn, especially when it comes to the people you love most. The story begins 2 years ago in Lawrence, Kansas, where I'd lived my entire adult life. My husband Frank had passed away after a brief but brutal battle with cancer, leaving me alone in the 4-bedroom colonial we'd bought when we were young, and foolish enough to believe that love could conquer anything. The house sat on Maple Street, lined with oak trees that Frank and I had watched grow from saplings into towering giants that shaded our front porch every summer afternoon. After Frank's funeral, the silence in that house became deafening. Every creaking floorboard reminded me of his heavy footsteps coming home from the railroad yard. Every empty coffee cup in the sink felt like a monument to conversations we'd never have again. The house that had once buzzed with the chaos of raising 3 children, sleepovers, birthday parties, homework battles around the kitchen table, now felt like a museum of memories I wasn't ready to face alone. That's when my eldest daughter, Jennifer, suggested what seemed like the perfect solution. Jennifer had always been the practical one, the child who color-coded her school folders and planned her birthday parties 6 months in advance. She lived just 20 minutes away with her husband, Mark, and their 2 teenage children in a neighborhood where every house looked like it had been designed by the same committee. Beige siding, black shutters, and lawns so perfectly manicured they looked artificial. "Mom, you shouldn't be rattling around in that big house all by yourself," Jennifer said during one of her weekly visits, her voice carrying that tone of gentle authority she'd perfected as a real estate agent. "Why don't you move in with us? We've got plenty of space and it would be so much better for everyone." The offer felt like a lifeline. I was drowning in grief, struggling to maintain a house that seemed to grow larger and more demanding each day. The water heater had started making ominous groaning sounds, the gutters needed cleaning, and the garden Frank had lovingly tended was becoming an overgrown jungle that mocked my attempts to keep it alive. Moving in with Jennifer meant companionship, help with daily tasks, and the chance to be closer to my grandchildren, Sarah and Michael, who were 15 and 17 respectively. What I didn't realize at the time was that Jennifer's invitation came with strings attached, invisible threads of expectation and control that would slowly strangle the independence I'd spent 7 decades building. The transition began smoothly enough. Jennifer and Mark cleared out their formal dining room, converting it into a bedroom for me. They moved in a single bed, a small dresser, and a reading chair from their living room set. The space was functional but sterile, lacking any of the warmth or personality that had defined my life with Frank. Still, I told myself it was temporary, just until I figured out what to do with the house on Maple Street. Jennifer had strong opinions about that house from the very beginning. "You need to sell it, Mom," she'd say whenever the subject came up. "The real estate market is hot right now, and you could get a really good price. Think of all the stress it would eliminate. No more property taxes, no more maintenance headaches, no more worrying about break-ins or vandalism." But I wasn't ready to let go. That house wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was the place where Frank and I had built our life together, where we'd raised our children, where every room held fragments of our history. The kitchen where I'd taught Jennifer to make Christmas cookies. The living room where Frank had fallen asleep in his recliner every Sunday afternoon while football played on the television. The master bedroom where we'd whispered our dreams and fears in the darkness, planning futures we thought we had forever to explore. So I kept paying the mortgage, kept maintaining 2 residences, while living full-time with Jennifer's family. It was expensive and illogical, but it felt necessary, like keeping a piece of my former life on life support until I was strong enough to decide its fate. Living with Jennifer revealed sides of my daughter I'd never fully appreciated, and not always in positive ways. She ran her household with military precision, every meal planned a week in advance, every activity scheduled and color-coded on a massive calendar that dominated the kitchen wall. Spontaneity was the enemy of efficiency in Jennifer's world, and I quickly learned that my mere presence disrupted the carefully orchestrated rhythm of their daily lives. Mark worked long hours as an insurance adjuster, leaving early each morning and returning home exhausted and eager for the peace and quiet he'd been denied all day. He was polite to me, always, but I could sense his frustration when I asked him to repeat something, or when my slower pace delayed their evening routines. The children, Sarah and Michael, were absorbed in their own teenage dramas, soccer practice, part-time jobs, college applications, and the endless social complications that define that particular stage of life. I found myself becoming increasingly invisible in their home, a piece of furniture they had to navigate around but rarely acknowledged. Conversations at dinner often flew over my head, filled with references to people I didn't know and situations I couldn't follow. When I tried to contribute, offering advice based on my own experiences or asking questions about their lives, I was met with polite but distant responses that made it clear my input wasn't particularly valued or desired. The first real crack in our arrangement appeared about 6 months after I'd moved in. I had offered to cook dinner one evening, thinking I could give Jennifer a break from her usual routine, while also contributing something meaningful to the household. I spent the afternoon preparing Frank's famous pot roast, the same recipe I'd been perfecting for 30 years. The kitchen filled with the rich, comforting aromas of beef and vegetables, and for a few hours, I felt useful again. When the family gathered around the dinner table, I served the meal with pride, expecting the kind of appreciation I'd grown accustomed to over decades of family dinners. Instead, Jennifer picked at her food with barely concealed distaste, while Mark chewed mechanically, and the children made faces they thought I couldn't see. "It's a little heavy, Mom," Jennifer finally said, her voice carefully neutral. "We've been trying to eat lighter lately. More fish, less red meat, and the sodium content in this is probably through the roof." The criticism stung more than it should have. This wasn't just about a meal, it was about my relevance, my ability to contribute something of value to their lives. I had been reduced to a well-meaning but ultimately incompetent houseguest in my own daughter's home, someone whose efforts were more burdensome than helpful. That night, lying in the converted dining room that had never quite felt like my own space, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. The house on Maple Street suddenly felt less like a burden and more like a sanctuary, a place where my pot roast had always been welcome, where my pace was the only pace that mattered, where I was the author of my own story rather than a supporting character in someone else's narrative. But I pushed those doubts aside, telling myself that adjustment takes time, that families need space to find their new rhythms. I had no way of knowing that Jennifer's patience with my presence was already wearing thin, or that the real test of our relationship was still months away. What I did know was that something fundamental had shifted in the way my daughter saw me. I was no longer Dorothy Henderson, the woman who had raised 3 children while working part-time at the local library, who had supported Frank through 2 job layoffs and a heart attack, who had volunteered at the school district for 15 years and organized countless church fundraisers. I was becoming, in Jennifer's eyes, simply an aging parent who required management, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The winter months brought a new kind of cold to Jennifer's house. Not just the Kansas wind that rattled the windows, but an emotional chill that seemed to seep through every interaction. What had started as minor irritations began crystallizing into a pattern of systematic exclusion that I was slow to recognize but impossible to ignore once I did. It began with the small things, the kind of slights that could easily be explained away if you were determined to maintain the illusion of family harmony. Jennifer started making decisions about household routines without consulting me. She'd schedule grocery pickups during times when I normally liked to sit on the front porch with my morning coffee. She'd plan family movie nights and casually mention them after the fact, as if my participation had never been a consideration. When I'd ask about joining them, she'd smile tightly and say, "Oh, you probably wouldn't like this one, Mom. It's pretty loud and fast-paced." The message was clear. I was too old, too slow, too out of touch to be included in their real family life. Mark's behavior became increasingly telling as well. He'd developed a habit of walking faster whenever I was with them in public, forcing me to hurry to keep up or fall behind and look abandoned. At home, he'd turn up the television volume whenever I entered the living room, making conversation impossible. When I'd ask him to turn it down, he'd comply with exaggerated patience, as if I were a difficult child interrupting the adults. The children, Sarah and Michael, absorbed these cues with the swift adaptation that teenagers possess. They stopped asking me about my day or sharing stories about school. When friends came over, I was introduced with hurried politeness before being quietly shuffled out of the way. I became the grandmother they acknowledged when necessary, but preferred to forget about when possible. But it was Jennifer's management of my relationship with the house on Maple Street that revealed the true scope of her plan to control my life. Every few weeks, she'd bring up selling the property with increasing urgency. She'd print out real estate listings, showing me what other houses in my neighborhood had sold for. She'd calculate the money I was wasting on property taxes and maintenance. She'd even go so far as to drive me past the house, pointing out every flaw: the peeling paint on the shutters, the crack in the driveway, the way the front porch sagged slightly on one side. "Mom, you're throwing money away," she'd say, her voice taking on the professional tone she used with her real estate clients. "That house is becoming a money pit, and you're not even living there. Think about what you could do with that equity. Invest it, travel, enjoy your retirement, instead of worrying about leaky pipes and broken furnaces." What Jennifer didn't understand, or chose not to understand, was that the house represented more than financial investment to me. It was my insurance policy, my escape route, my proof that I still had choices in a world that seemed increasingly determined to limit them. As long as I owned that house, I wasn't completely dependent on her charity. I could leave if I needed to. I could maintain the fiction that I was choosing to stay rather than having nowhere else to go. The psychological warfare escalated in subtle ways throughout the spring. Jennifer began scheduling activities that deliberately excluded me. She'd plan family barbecues on days when I had doctor's appointments, then express disappointment that I'd chosen not to participate. She'd organize shopping trips to stores I couldn't navigate easily due to my arthritis, then suggest I stay home and rest instead. She'd invite her siblings, my other children, for visits, but coordinate the timing so that I'd be napping or occupied with other tasks. The most painful exclusion came during Sarah's 16th birthday party. Jennifer had planned an elaborate celebration in the backyard, complete with a DJ, catered food, and decorations that transformed their modest patio into something resembling a magazine photo shoot. I had offered to help with the preparations, suggesting I could make Sarah's favorite cake, a 3-layer chocolate creation I'd been perfecting since she was small. "That's so sweet of you to offer, Mom," Jennifer said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "But I've already ordered something from that bakery downtown. You know, the one that does those fancy fondant designs?" Sarah specifically requested it. The lie was gentle, but unmistakable. Sarah had never mentioned any specific bakery to me, and I knew my granddaughter well enough to know she preferred homemade desserts to store-bought ones. But questioning Jennifer's version of events would have made me look petty and suspicious, so I smiled and nodded and pretended to believe her. On the day of the party, I found myself relegated to greeting guests at the front door, a position that kept me busy and visible enough to avoid accusations of being antisocial, but removed enough from the actual celebration to minimize my impact on the carefully curated atmosphere Jennifer had created. I watched through the kitchen window as my granddaughter laughed with her friends, as Jennifer played the perfect hostess, as Mark grilled burgers and pretended to be more social than he actually was. I was family, but I wasn't part of the family. I was present, but not participating. I was included, but only in the most superficial way possible. The breaking point came in early summer, during what should have been a routine family dinner. Mark had been complaining about his workload, describing a particularly difficult insurance claim involving a house fire that had left an elderly couple homeless. The conversation naturally turned to the importance of maintaining proper home insurance and keeping properties in good condition. "Speaking of property maintenance," Jennifer said, seizing the opening with the calculated timing of someone who had been waiting for the right moment. "Mom, I drove past your house yesterday, and I'm really worried about the state it's in. This was news to me. I visited the house every few weeks to check on things, and while it certainly wasn't perfect, it was far from the disaster Jennifer was about to describe. The gutters are pulling away from the roofline, she continued, her voice filled with the kind of concern that sounds genuine, unless you know the person well enough to recognize the performance. There's a dead tree limb hanging over the garage that's going to come down in the next storm. And I swear the foundation is starting to settle unevenly. The whole front porch is starting to lean. Mark nodded gravely, as if he'd personally inspected the property, though I was certain he'd never set foot on the grounds. Properties like that can become real liabilities, he said. If something happens, if that tree limb falls and damages a neighbor's car, or if someone gets hurt on that uneven porch, you could be looking at serious lawsuits. The children watched this exchange, with the uncomfortable awareness that comes from witnessing adult conversations they don't fully understand but recognize as important. Sarah kept her eyes on her plate, while Michael shifted restlessly in his chair. I felt my chest tighten with a familiar combination of anger and helplessness. They were painting my beloved home as a dangerous ruin, creating a narrative that justified their desire to see it sold while positioning themselves as the responsible family members trying to protect me from my own poor judgment. I think you're exaggerating the problems, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. The house needs some work, certainly, but it's not falling down. Jennifer exchanged a look with Mark, one of those wordless communications that married couples develop over time. It was a look that said, "See? This is exactly what we were talking about. She's not thinking clearly anymore." "Mom," Jennifer said, her voice taking on the patient tone people use when explaining something to a child, "I think maybe you're not seeing the house objectively anymore. It's understandable. You have so many emotional connections to the place that it's hard to see it clearly. But from a practical standpoint, keeping that house is becoming more trouble than it's worth." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Jennifer and Mark tag-teaming me with reasonable-sounding arguments about financial responsibility and safety concerns. They spoke about me as if I weren't sitting right there, discussing my mental state and decision-making capacity with the casual authority of people who had already decided what was best for me. That night, as I lay in the converted dining room listening to the house settle around me, I realized that the battle for my independence was no longer theoretical. Jennifer wasn't just suggesting I sell the house, she was building a case for why I was no longer competent to make that decision myself. Every concern about the property was really a question about my judgment. Every suggestion about my living situation was really an assertion of her authority over my life. I stared at the ceiling and made a mental note to visit the house on Maple Street the next day. I needed to see for myself whether Jennifer's dire warnings had any basis in reality, or whether she was simply manufacturing crises to support her agenda. What I found there would determine my next move in what was becoming an increasingly dangerous game of family chess. But more than that, I needed to remind myself who I really was. Not the diminished, dependent old woman Jennifer was trying to convince me I'd become, but Dorothy Henderson, property owner, decision-maker, and someone who still had cards left to play. The next morning, I borrowed Jennifer's car under the pretense of running errands downtown. She handed me the keys with barely concealed irritation, reminding me to be careful with the backup camera and to make sure I didn't scratch the paint on the garage door frame. Her lack of trust stung, but I swallowed my pride and promised to drive carefully, as if I hadn't been navigating Kansas roads for over 50 years. The drive to Maple Street felt like traveling backward through time. Each familiar landmark triggered a cascade of memories. The corner gas station where Frank used to buy his morning coffee, the elementary school where I'd volunteered as a crossing guard, the small park where we'd taught our children to ride bicycles. As I turned onto my old street, my heart began to race with an anticipation I hadn't felt in months. The house stood exactly as I remembered it, and Jennifer's dire warnings immediately revealed themselves as dramatic exaggerations designed to serve her agenda. Yes, the gutters needed some attention, but they were hardly pulling away from the roofline. The tree limb she'd mentioned was real but small, something that could be handled with a simple phone call to a tree service. The front porch that was supposedly starting to lean showed no signs of structural damage whatsoever. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, taking in the sight of the home Frank and I had shared for 3 decades. The red brick facade looked solid and welcoming. The windows gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and the small flower garden I'd been neglecting showed signs of determined growth despite my absence. This wasn't a crumbling ruin. It was simply a house that needed its owner to come home. Using my old key felt like a ritual of reclamation. The front door opened with the same familiar creak it had always made, and I stepped into the entry hall where Frank's coat still hung on the wooden peg he'd installed himself. The air smelled faintly of the lemon polish I'd always used on the furniture, mixed with the lingering essence of a life lived fully within these walls. I walked through each room methodically, taking inventory not just of the house's physical condition but of my own emotional state. In the kitchen, I ran my hands along the countertops where I'd prepared thousands of meals, where Frank and I had shared morning coffee while planning our days. The appliances were older but functional, the cabinets sturdy and well-built. Nothing here suggested the emergency Jennifer had described. The living room told the same story. Furniture that might be dated but was far from decrepit. Hardwood floors that showed wear but retained their essential integrity. Windows that needed cleaning but let in beautiful natural light. I sat in Frank's old recliner and tried to imagine myself living here again, alone but independent, making my own decisions about my own life. That's when I noticed the stack of mail on the coffee table, letters that had been delivered and apparently collected by someone with a key. My blood ran cold as I rifled through the envelopes. Bills that had been opened and resealed. Official correspondence that bore signs of having been read by someone other than me. And most disturbing of all, several pieces of mail from real estate agencies that I had definitely never contacted. The evidence was undeniable. Jennifer had been accessing my house without my permission, going through my private mail, and apparently entertaining conversations with real estate professionals about selling my property. The betrayal cut deeper than any of her subtle slights or manipulative conversations. This was a violation of my privacy and my autonomy that crossed every boundary I thought still existed between us. I found more evidence upstairs in the master bedroom. Someone had been through Frank's closet, removing most of his clothes and personal items. The drawers in his dresser were nearly empty, and several pieces of furniture were missing entirely. When I called Jennifer from the house phone, my hands shaking with anger, her explanation was smooth and practiced. "Oh, Mom, I meant to tell you about that," she said, her voice carefully casual. "I thought it would be easier for you if we donated Dad's things while you weren't there to get upset about it. I know how hard it is for you to let go of his stuff, so I took care of it for you. Wasn't that thoughtful?" Thoughtful. She had violated my home, disposed of my husband's belongings without my consent, and somehow convinced herself that she was doing me a favor. The casual cruelty of it left me speechless. "I also had some real estate friends stop by to give us a professional assessment," she continued, apparently mistaking my silence for approval. "Just so we'd know what we're working with when you're ready to make the move. The market is really hot right now, Mom. We could probably get you a much better price than we would have 6 months ago." The "we" in that sentence crystallized everything I needed to understand about Jennifer's perspective. In her mind, the house had already become a joint asset, something she had a right to manage and profit from. My ownership was apparently just a temporary inconvenience that would soon be resolved through her superior decision-making abilities. After hanging up the phone, I spent another hour in the house, this time not just assessing its condition, but planning my next moves. I called my old neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 doors down and had always been a reliable source of neighborhood information. She confirmed that Jennifer had been coming by regularly, sometimes with real estate agents, and had told people that the house would be going on the market soon. "I thought it was strange that she was making those decisions without you being here," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice full of the kind of diplomatic concern that comes from not wanting to criticize someone's family while also expressing genuine worry. "But she seemed so confident about it all, I figured you must have given her permission." I also discovered that Jennifer had been intercepting calls to the house's landline, apparently having the number forwarded to her own phone. When I called the phone company to verify this, they confirmed that a forwarding service had been activated 3 months earlier by someone claiming to be handling my affairs due to my declining health. The lie was so elaborate and premeditated that it took my breath away. Sitting in Frank's recliner as the afternoon sun slanted through the living room windows, I finally understood the full scope of what Jennifer was attempting. This wasn't just about selling my house or managing my living situation. She was systematically taking control of my entire life, piece by piece, decision by decision. She had convinced herself that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, and she was acting on that belief without ever giving me a chance to prove her wrong. The house around me felt like a sanctuary under siege. Every room contained evidence of Jennifer's unauthorized intrusions, but also reminders of my own agency and capability. I had maintained this property for years after Frank's death. I had handled the mortgage payments, the utility bills, the routine maintenance that any homeowner manages. I wasn't the declining, incompetent old woman Jennifer needed me to be, to justify her takeover of my life. As I prepared to leave, I made several important phone calls. First, to a locksmith who agreed to come out the next day to change all the locks. Second, to the phone company to cancel the call forwarding service immediately. Third, to my lawyer, a man named Robert Chen, who had handled Frank's will and knew me well enough to understand that I was still fully capable of making my own decisions. "Dorothy," Robert said when I explained the situation, "what you're describing sounds like someone is trying to establish grounds for a conservatorship or guardianship proceeding. Have you given anyone power of attorney over your affairs?" I assured him that I had not, and he explained that Jennifer's actions, accessing my mail, making decisions about my property, representing herself as my caretaker to third parties, could potentially be used to build a case that I was no longer competent to manage my own life. "We need to act quickly to establish your independence and mental capacity," he advised. "And we need to document everything Jennifer has done without your permission. If she's planning what I think she's planning, you're going to need proof that you're fully capable of making your own decisions." As I drove back to Jennifer's house that evening, my mind was clear for the first time in months. The fog of self-doubt and family loyalty that had clouded my judgment was finally lifting, replaced by a cold, determined clarity about what needed to happen next. Jennifer had overplayed her hand, and she was about to discover that her burden of a mother still had plenty of fight left in her. The eviction papers that would soon bear her name were already forming in my mind, but they would be just the beginning of my campaign to reclaim my independence. The war for my autonomy was about to begin in earnest, and I intended to win it. The days following my discovery at the Maple Street house moved with the swift precision of a chess game, where I finally understood the rules my opponent had been playing by all along. While Jennifer continued her daily routine of managing my life with suffocating efficiency, I began building my own strategy with the methodical care of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. My first meeting with Robert Chen took place on a Tuesday morning while Jennifer believed I was attending a senior center art class she had enthusiastically enrolled me in. Instead, I sat across from Robert's mahogany desk in his downtown office, laying out the evidence of Jennifer's unauthorized activities with the systematic approach of someone building a legal case. Robert was a second-generation Chinese-American lawyer in his 50s, with graying temples and the kind of sharp analytical mind that cut through emotional complexity to focus on legal realities. He had handled Frank's estate planning and knew me well enough to understand that my faculties were completely intact, despite what Jennifer might want others to believe. "Dorothy, what your daughter has done goes far beyond overstepping boundaries," Robert said, reviewing the documentation I'd brought. Copies of the forwarded phone records, photographs of my ransacked house, written statements from Mrs. Patterson about the real estate agents. "She's essentially been conducting what we call financial elder abuse, taking control of your property and affairs without legal authority." The term hit me like a physical blow. Financial elder abuse. I had become a statistic, a victim of the very person I had raised and loved unconditionally. But Robert's next words transformed my shock into something far more useful: determination. "The good news is that because you discovered this before she could establish any legal guardianship or conservatorship, we have multiple options for recourse. Since you own the house she's living in, eviction is not only possible but legally straightforward. She's been living there as your guest, not as a tenant with formal rights. That revelation stopped me cold. In all the months of feeling like a burden in Jennifer's home, I had somehow forgotten the most fundamental fact about our arrangement. The house belonged to me. I had deeded the property to Jennifer and Mark 5 years earlier as part of an estate planning strategy Robert had recommended, but the deed included a specific clause that allowed me to retain lifetime residency rights and the authority to revoke their occupancy under certain circumstances. "You mean I can legally remove them from the house?" I asked, hardly believing what I was hearing. "Not only can you remove them," Robert said, his expression growing more animated as he warmed to the legal possibilities, "but given Jennifer's unauthorized access to your Maple Street property and her apparent attempts to establish control over your affairs, we have grounds to argue that she's violated the terms of trust that governed the property transfer." Over the next hour, Robert outlined a strategy that was both elegant and devastating. We would file eviction papers against Jennifer and Mark, citing violation of the occupancy agreement and breach of fiduciary duty. Simultaneously, we would seek a restraining order preventing Jennifer from accessing my Maple Street property or representing herself as my caretaker or decision-maker to any third parties. "The beauty of this approach," Robert explained, "is that it immediately establishes your mental competency and independence. No one who is legally incompetent could initiate such complex legal proceedings. It completely undermines any future attempts she might make to claim you're unable to manage your own affairs." But Robert's most brilliant suggestion came at the end of our meeting. "We're going to serve these papers in the most public, undeniable way possible. I recommend having the sheriff deliver them when Jennifer is hosting one of her neighborhood gatherings. Nothing says I'm mentally competent and legally empowered quite like successfully orchestrating someone's eviction while they're trying to convince their friends that you're a helpless burden." The irony was perfect. Jennifer, who had spent months systematically undermining my independence and competence, would be evicted from her own home by the very woman she considered too incompetent to manage her own affairs. Robert and I spent the next week preparing the legal documents with meticulous care. Every allegation had to be supported by evidence, every claim backed by documentation. We gathered bank records showing that I had been independently managing my finances throughout my stay at Jennifer's house. We obtained medical records from my recent doctor's visit confirming that I had no cognitive impairments or health issues that would affect my decision-making capacity. Most importantly, we documented every instance of Jennifer's unauthorized activities: the mail forwarding, the real estate consultations, the removal of Frank's belongings, the key copying that had allowed her access to my house. What had seemed like isolated incidents of overreach suddenly formed a clear pattern of systematic control and manipulation. During this period, I maintained the facade of being the compliant, slightly confused elderly mother that Jennifer expected me to be. I attended the senior center activities she had scheduled for me, smiled politely during her lectures about proper nutrition and exercise, and nodded agreeably when she discussed her concerns about my increasing forgetfulness with Mark during dinner conversations that I was apparently too addled to follow. The performance was exhausting but necessary. Jennifer needed to believe that she remained in complete control right up until the moment when that control was dramatically and publicly revoked. I found a certain grim satisfaction in her condescending kindness, knowing that each patronizing smile and carefully simplified explanation was another piece of evidence for the case I was building against her. The most challenging aspect of this period was maintaining my relationship with Sarah and Michael. They were innocent victims of their mother's manipulation, and I didn't want my necessary actions to damage their perception of family relationships permanently. I began having quiet conversations with each of them individually, asking about their thoughts on family, independence, and respect for elderly relatives in general terms. What I discovered broke my heart but also strengthened my resolve. Both children had absorbed their parents' narrative about my declining capabilities so completely that they genuinely believed they were being kind by treating me like a fragile, slightly incompetent relative who needed constant management. Sarah admitted that she had been told to speak slowly and clearly around me because I was, quote, having trouble processing information. Michael confessed that he had been instructed to help me with simple tasks because I was getting confused easily. Jennifer had not only been undermining my independence, she had been teaching her children to see me as less than fully human, a diminished version of their grandmother, who required their pity rather than their respect. The psychological damage she was inflicting extended far beyond our immediate relationship, and into the next generation's understanding of aging, family, and human dignity. My anger crystallized into something cold and implacable during a family dinner in late July. Jennifer had invited her book club friends over for what she called a literary salon, an evening of wine, cheese, and pretentious discussion about whatever novel they were currently reading. I had been relegated to the kitchen, tasked with washing dishes and staying out of the way while the real conversation happened in the living room. As I stood at the sink, I could hear Jennifer holding court about the challenges of caring for aging parents. Her voice carried clearly through the thin walls as she described the difficult decisions families faced when elderly relatives could no longer live independently. She spoke about me as if I were a cautionary tale, a burden that responsible adult children had to shoulder with grace and patience. "It's so hard to know when to step in," she said, her voice heavy with the kind of practiced sympathy that comes from telling the same story multiple times. "You want to respect their independence, but you also have to protect them from their own poor judgment. Sometimes love means making the hard choices for people who can't make them for themselves anymore." Her friends murmured sympathetic agreement, praising Jennifer's selflessness and dedication. They spoke about me as if I were not just absent from the room but absent from life itself, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Standing there with my hands in the soapy water, listening to my daughter reduce my existence to a burden she bore with noble suffering, I felt the last vestiges of doubt about my planned course of action disappear. Jennifer had made her choice about who I was and what I was worth. Now she would live with the consequences of that choice. Maka. The eviction papers were ready. The restraining order was prepared. The sheriff had been contacted and briefed. All that remained was choosing the perfect moment to serve them, a moment that would make it impossible for Jennifer to claim that I was confused, manipulated, or acting under someone else's influence. That moment would come sooner than I expected, and when it did, I would be ready to show Jennifer and everyone else exactly how competent and decisive this burden could be when pushed too far. The opportunity I had been waiting for presented itself on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in early August, when Jennifer decided to host what she grandly called her summer neighborhood soiree. She had been planning the event for weeks, sending out carefully designed invitations, coordinating with caterers, and transforming the backyard into an Instagram-worthy showcase of her domestic perfection. The guest list read like a who's who of Lawrence's most influential residents: city council members, successful business owners, prominent church leaders, and several families from the exclusive country club where Jennifer and Mark held memberships they could barely afford. This wasn't just a social gathering. It was Jennifer's attempt to cement her position in the community's upper echelon, using the impressive house she had inherited from me as the backdrop for her social climbing. For weeks leading up to the party, Jennifer's anxiety about my presence had been palpable. She had made increasingly direct suggestions that I might want to spend the afternoon at the senior center, or perhaps visit my sister in Topeka, or even just rest in my room during the festivities. Her concerns weren't about my comfort. They were about how my presence might reflect on her carefully cultivated image as a successful, sophisticated hostess. "Mom, you know how these events can be," she said during one of her more transparent attempts to exclude me. "Lots of noise, people you don't know, conversations about business and politics that might not interest you. Wouldn't you be more comfortable just relaxing somewhere quiet?" But I had no intention of making myself scarce. This party represented the perfect convergence of circumstances: maximum witnesses, peak social pressure, and Jennifer at her most vulnerable to public embarrassment. Robert had coordinated with the sheriff's department to time the service of papers for peak party attendance, ensuring that Jennifer's humiliation would be as complete and witnessed as possible. The morning of the party, I played my role perfectly. I helped Jennifer arrange flowers, expressed admiration for her menu choices, and even offered to assist with greeting guests at the door. My cooperative attitude clearly surprised her, but she was too focused on her preparations to question my sudden enthusiasm for an event she had been trying to exclude me from. As guests began arriving around 2 o'clock, I positioned myself strategically on the front porch, dressed in my best summer dress and wearing the pearl necklace Frank had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look dignified, competent, and completely in control when the sheriff arrived. Every guest who passed me would later remember seeing a well-dressed, alert, elderly woman who showed no signs of the confusion or incompetence Jennifer had been describing to her friends. Jennifer flitted around the backyard like a nervous butterfly, ensuring that every detail met her exacting standards. She had hired a jazz trio to provide background music, arranged elaborate flower displays on every table, and instructed the catering staff to present the food with restaurant-quality precision. The party was costing more than most people spent on vacations, but Jennifer seemed determined to prove that she belonged among Lawrence's social elite. Mark worked the crowd with the forced joviality of someone who would rather be anywhere else, discussing golf handicaps and stock market trends with men whose success made his own modest achievements pale in comparison. The children moved through the gathering with teenage awkwardness, clearly uncomfortable with their parents' obvious social striving but too young to understand the full implications of what they were witnessing. Around 3:30, as the party reached its peak attendance and Jennifer was basking in the compliments of her impressed guests, I spotted the sheriff's car turning onto our street. Deputy Martinez, a serious young woman in her 30s whom Robert had briefed thoroughly on the situation, parked discreetly but visibly in front of the house. The sight of a law enforcement vehicle immediately caught the attention of several guests, who began murmuring among themselves about what possible issue could require police attention at such an elegant gathering. I met Deputy Martinez at the front gate, greeting her with the calm professionalism of someone who had been expecting her arrival. She carried an official-looking manila envelope and wore the expression of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, speaking loudly enough that nearby guests could hear every word, "I have legal documents that require service to Jennifer Morrison and Mark Morrison. Are they available to receive these papers?" The formal language and official tone immediately transformed the casual social atmosphere into something far more serious. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as guests turned to watch the drama unfolding on the front lawn. Several people began pulling out their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something significant enough to document. I directed Deputy Martinez to the backyard, where Jennifer was holding court near the outdoor bar, describing her recent kitchen renovation to a captivated audience of neighborhood wives. The sight of a uniformed sheriff's deputy approaching with legal documents in hand caused a ripple of silence to spread across the gathering like stones dropped in still water. "Jennifer Morrison?" Deputy Martinez said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet backyard. Jennifer turned, her smile freezing as she took in the deputy's uniform and official demeanor. "Yes, that's me," she said, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. "You're being served with eviction papers and a restraining order, ma'am. These documents require you and your husband to vacate this property within 30 days and prohibit you from accessing or interfering with Dorothy Henderson's property on Maple Street." The words hit the gathering like a bomb. Guests stood frozen, drinks halfway to their lips, as the implications of what they were witnessing sank in. Jennifer Morrison, who had been presenting herself as the responsible daughter caring for her aging mother, was being evicted from her own home by that same mother. The woman they had been encouraged to see as a burden was revealing herself to be a property owner, with the legal authority to remove them from what they had assumed was their house. Jennifer's face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and rising panic as she accepted the legal papers with trembling hands. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is my house. I live here. My mother, she's not. She can't." Mark appeared at her side, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger, as he realized that their social humiliation was being witnessed by everyone they had been trying to impress. He grabbed the papers from Jennifer's hands and scanned them quickly, his expression darkening as he read the detailed allegations of unauthorized access to my property and financial interference. "What the hell is this about?" he demanded, his carefully maintained social facade cracking under the pressure of public embarrassment. I stepped forward then, my voice clear and strong as I addressed not just Jennifer and Mark, but the entire gathering of witnesses. "These papers are about respect, dignity, and the consequences of treating someone like a burden when they're actually your landlord." The crowd gasped audibly at this revelation. Jennifer's carefully constructed narrative about caring for her declining mother was crumbling in real time, replaced by the far more complex reality of family manipulation and financial control. The woman they had pitied as a confused elderly burden was demonstrating sharp legal thinking and strategic planning that put her daughter's machinations to shame. Jennifer looked around desperately at her guests, seeking sympathy or support, but found only curious stares and uncomfortable silence. These people had come to enjoy her hospitality and be impressed by her success, not to witness her complete social destruction. Several couples were already making discreet exits, unwilling to be associated with the drama unfolding before them. "Mom, please," Jennifer said, her voice breaking as the full magnitude of her situation became clear. "Can't we discuss this privately? These people don't need to see family business." But I was beyond the point of protecting Jennifer's dignity at the expense of my own. "You made it public when you told everyone I was a burden you were nobly carrying," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the silent backyard. "You made it public when you went through my mail, disposed of my husband's belongings, and tried to sell my house without my permission. You made it public when you taught your children to see me as less than fully human." The accusations hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Jennifer's social circle was getting a masterclass in the difference between perception and reality, between the stories people tell about themselves and the truth of their actions. Deputy Martinez completed her official duties with professional efficiency, ensuring that both Jennifer and Mark acknowledged receipt of the papers and understood their legal obligations. As she prepared to leave, she turned to me with something that might have been approval in her eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, if you need any assistance with these proceedings or if there are any violations of the restraining order, please don't hesitate to contact our office." The formal acknowledgement of my competence and authority, delivered in front of Jennifer's entire social circle, was the final nail in the coffin of her credibility. As the deputy's car pulled away, the party guests began their own exodus, leaving Jennifer and Mark standing alone in their beautifully decorated backyard, surrounded by the remnants of their failed social triumph. I stood on the front porch, watching the last of the cars disappear down the street, feeling a satisfaction so pure it was almost intoxicating. The war for my independence was far from over, but I had just won the most important battle of all, the battle for public recognition of my competence and authority. Jennifer would never again be able to claim that I was a confused burden who needed her management. The entire Lawrence social scene had just witnessed her eviction by the very woman she had been patronizing and controlling. The reversal was complete, public, and utterly devastating to her carefully constructed image. Now came the even more satisfying part, watching her try to explain this humiliation to everyone who mattered in her world. The hours following the party's spectacular collapse unfolded with the surreal quality of a fever dream. As the last guest's car disappeared around the corner, Jennifer stood motionless in the center of her ruined celebration, the eviction papers clutched in her white-knuckled grip like evidence of some impossible betrayal. The jazz trio had packed up their instruments in uncomfortable silence, the caterers were clearing away untouched hors d'oeuvre, and the elaborate floral arrangements suddenly looked like decorations for a funeral, rather than a celebration. Mark was the first to find his voice, though what emerged was more of a strangled roar than coherent speech. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, advancing on me with the kind of barely controlled rage that comes from public humiliation. "You just destroyed us in front of the entire neighborhood. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I stood my ground on the front porch, feeling calmer and more centered than I had in months. "I've reclaimed my property and my dignity," I said simply. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Jennifer finally seemed to shake off her paralysis, her face cycling through emotions like a slot machine searching for the right combination. "Mom, this is insane," she said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "You can't just evict us. This is our home. We have a mortgage. We have the kids' schools. We have our whole life here." The irony was so thick I could taste it. "Your whole life," I repeated. "Built in my house, subsidized by my generosity, while you systematically tried to convince everyone that I was too incompetent to manage my own affairs." That's when the full scope of Jennifer's miscalculation began to dawn on her. She had been so focused on controlling my assets and decisions that she had forgotten the most basic fact about our living arrangement. I wasn't her dependent guest. She was mine. The 30-day eviction notice was legally generous but practically devastating. Mark immediately began making frantic phone calls to lawyers, real estate agents, and mortgage companies, trying to understand their options in a situation that defied his understanding of property rights and family obligations. His voice carried from the kitchen as he explained their predicament to one professional after another, each conversation ending with increasingly desperate questions about emergency housing options. Sarah and Michael emerged from their rooms where they had been hiding since the sheriff's departure, their faces reflecting the confused terror that comes from watching your parents' authority structure completely collapse. They had spent their teenage years absorbing the narrative that their grandmother was a declining burden who required their patient tolerance. Now they were being forced to confront the reality that she possessed the legal power to make them homeless. "Grandma Dorothy," Sarah said, her voice small and uncertain, "what's going to happen to us?" The question broke my heart, but it also strengthened my resolve. These children needed to learn that actions have consequences, that treating people with disrespect and manipulation ultimately costs more than honesty and kindness ever could. "You're going to learn what it means to be responsible for your own lives," I said gently. "Your parents will figure out where you're going to live, just like millions of other families do every day. The difference is that they'll have to do it without taking advantage of someone they've been treating like a burden." Jennifer overheard this exchange and came rushing out of the kitchen, her hair disheveled and her carefully applied makeup streaked with tears. "You can't punish the children for our mistakes," she pleaded. "They don't understand what's happening. This isn't fair to them." "What wasn't fair," I replied, "was teaching them to see me as less than human. What wasn't fair was making them accomplices to your manipulation and disrespect. What wasn't fair was using my own generosity as a weapon against my independence." The next few days passed in a blur of frantic activity, as Jennifer and Mark scrambled to understand their legal position and explore their options. They consulted 3 different lawyers, all of whom delivered the same unwelcome news. I had every legal right to evict them. Their occupation of the house had always been dependent on my goodwill, and their unauthorized interference with my other property had eliminated any sympathy a court might have had for their situation. Robert Chen kept me informed of their legal maneuvering through the network of professional contacts that makes small city law practice as much about relationships as regulations. "They're exploring whether they can claim adverse possession or establish tenant rights," he reported during one of our check-in calls. "But since you have documented evidence of paying all the utilities, property taxes, and maintenance costs, their position is essentially hopeless." More interesting were the social repercussions that began rippling through Lawrence's tight-knit community. Jennifer's public humiliation at her own party had become the talk of every coffee shop, book club, and church gathering in town. The story was too dramatic and too perfectly ironic to remain private. The daughter who tried to control her incompetent mother being evicted by that same mother in front of their entire social circle. Mrs. Patterson called me 3 days after the party with updates from the neighborhood gossip network. "Everyone's talking about it, Dorothy," she said, barely containing her glee. "The way you handled that sheriff's deputy, the timing, the absolute shock on Jennifer's face. It's like something out of a movie. And people are asking questions they never asked before about how Jennifer was really treating you." The questions were exactly what I had hoped for. Neighbors who had previously accepted Jennifer's narrative about my declining capabilities were now remembering their own observations. Times when I had seemed perfectly alert and capable. Instances when Jennifer's explanations about my limitations hadn't quite matched what they had witnessed themselves. More importantly, other elderly residents of Lawrence were taking note of what had happened. I began receiving phone calls from women who had been dealing with their own adult children's attempts to manage their lives, their finances, and their independence. My public demonstration of legal and mental competence had become a beacon of hope for others who felt trapped by their family's well-intentioned but suffocating control. "Dorothy, I don't know if you realize what you've done," said Margaret Walsh, a 73-year-old widow whose son had been pressuring her to sell her house and move to assisted living. "You've shown all of us that we don't have to accept other people's definitions of what we're capable of. You've proved that being old doesn't mean being powerless." Meanwhile, Jennifer's attempts to salvage her social standing were becoming increasingly desperate and transparent. She began calling mutual friends and acquaintances, trying to explain the situation in terms that would restore some sympathy for her position. According to the reports that filtered back to me, she was portraying herself as the victim of my sudden mental decline, claiming that I had been manipulated by an unscrupulous lawyer into making decisions I didn't understand. But her explanations fell flat in the face of what people had witnessed. The woman who had served eviction papers with calm precision and delivered a coherent, devastating public explanation of her actions bore no resemblance to the confused, declining mother Jennifer was now trying to describe. If anything, her attempts to revise history were making her look even more manipulative and dishonest. The children's reactions were perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire situation. Sarah had initially been angry with me, accusing me of being cruel and vindictive toward her parents. But as the days passed and she began to overhear more of Jennifer and Mark's private conversations, her anger shifted toward a more complex understanding of what had actually been happening. "I never knew you owned this house," she confessed during one of our awkward encounters in the kitchen. "Mom always talked about it like it was theirs, like they were letting you stay here out of kindness." Michael's response was different but equally telling. He began asking questions about my life before Frank's death, about the work I had done and the decisions I had made. For the first time since I had moved in, he seemed to see me as a complete person, rather than just his aging grandmother who needed careful management. "Were you really forgetting things? Or were Mom and Dad just saying that?" he asked one evening, as we sat on the front porch watching the sunset. The question required careful consideration. I wanted to be honest without completely destroying his relationship with his parents, but I also wanted him to understand the importance of treating elderly people with respect and dignity. "I think your parents convinced themselves that I was more confused than I actually was," I said finally. "It's easier to take control of someone's life if you believe they can't handle it themselves. But believing something doesn't make it true." As the 30-day deadline approached, Jennifer's panic reached new heights. She had found a rental house on the other side of town, but the cost was significantly higher than what they had been paying me, which was nothing. And the down payment was straining their already tight finances. The lifestyle they had been living in my house was simply not sustainable when they had to pay market rates for equivalent accommodations. More than the financial pressure, though, was the social isolation that had followed their public humiliation. Invitations to parties and gatherings had dried up, their country club memberships felt awkward to maintain, and even casual friendships had become strained by the awkwardness of what everyone knew, but no one wanted to discuss directly. Jennifer made one final attempt to negotiate with me, approaching me with a carefully prepared speech about family forgiveness and starting over. But her words rang hollow after months of manipulation and disrespect. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed simply because the consequences have become inconvenient. "Mom," she said, tears streaming down her face, "I know we made mistakes, but we're family. Doesn't that count for something?" It was the same card she had been playing for months. Family obligation as a justification for unequal treatment and disrespect. But I was done being held hostage by genetic relationships that had become one-sided and toxic. "Family," I replied, "is supposed to be about mutual respect and love. What you showed me was control and condescension. If you want to rebuild our relationship, you'll have to start by treating me like an equal, not like a burden you're managing out of duty." The conversation ended there, and I knew that Jennifer finally understood that her eviction was not a negotiating tactic or a temporary punishment. It was a permanent change in the power dynamic of our relationship, one that she would have to accept if she wanted any relationship with me at all. Moving day arrived with the peculiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that accompanies any irreversible decision. I stood at the kitchen window, watching as the moving truck backed into the driveway, its diesel engine rumbling like a mechanical heartbeat that would soon carry away the last physical traces of Jennifer and Mark's occupation of my home. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was finally getting what I had originally wanted when Jennifer invited me to live with them: a chance to downsize, to simplify my life, to find a living arrangement that suited my actual needs rather than someone else's assumptions about what those needs should be. The difference was that now I was making these choices on my own terms, with my dignity intact and my independence firmly established. Jennifer moved through the house like a ghost haunting her own eviction, directing the movers with hollow efficiency while carefully avoiding eye contact with me. She had lost weight over the past month, and the stress lines around her eyes had deepened into permanent creases that aged her beyond her 43 years. The woman who had once managed everyone's life with crisp authority now moved with the uncertain gait of someone who had discovered that her power had always been an illusion. Mark's handling of the situation was characteristically blunt and bitter. He supervised the loading of their furniture with the grim determination of a general conducting a strategic retreat, barking orders at the moving crew and making pointed comments about the injustice of their situation that were clearly intended for my ears. 20 years of mortgage payments, he muttered as the movers struggled with their oversized sectional sofa. 20 years of building equity in a house that was never really ours. Should have read the fine print on that deed transfer. His resentment was understandable but misplaced. The deed transfer had been structured exactly as my lawyer had recommended, with clear provisions for my lifetime residency rights and the authority to revoke their occupancy under specified circumstances. Jennifer and Mark had benefited enormously from living in a house they couldn't have afforded to buy on their own, but they had chosen to treat that privilege as an entitlement. The children's responses to the move revealed the different ways people processed the collapse of their assumed reality. Sarah had thrown herself into the logistics of relocating with teenage intensity, creating detailed lists of everything that needed to be packed, researching their new neighborhood, and planning how to maintain her social connections despite the geographical shift. Her hyperactivity was clearly a coping mechanism, a way to avoid thinking too deeply about the family dynamics that had led to this upheaval. Michael, on the other hand, had become quietly observational in a way that reminded me of his grandfather Frank. He watched the proceedings with thoughtful attention, asking occasional questions about why certain decisions had been made and what alternatives might have been possible. During a brief conversation while his parents were occupied with the movers, he revealed a level of insight that surprised me. "I've been thinking about what you said about believing something, not making it true," he said, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation. "I think Mom and Dad started believing their own story about you being confused, even when the evidence didn't really support it." His observation was remarkably astute for a 17-year-old, and it highlighted one of the most insidious aspects of Jennifer's behavior. She hadn't been consciously lying about my capabilities. She had convinced herself that her narrative was accurate, which made her manipulation feel justified and necessary rather than cruel and self-serving. As the morning progressed, neighbors began finding excuses to be outside, watering their lawns, checking their mailboxes, walking their dogs with unusual frequency. The Henderson family drama had become the neighborhood's most compelling entertainment, and no one wanted to miss the final act of what had been an increasingly public spectacle. Mrs. Patterson made no pretense of subtlety, setting up a lawn chair on her front porch with a clear view of the proceedings. When she caught my eye, she raised her coffee mug in a small salute that somehow managed to convey both approval and amusement. The gesture made me smile despite the emotional complexity of the day. The most revealing moment came when Jennifer discovered that I had already arranged for my own moving preparations. While she and Mark had been focused on their frantic search for new housing, I had been quietly organizing my transition back to the Maple Street house. A smaller moving crew was scheduled to arrive in the afternoon to transport my belongings. Not many, since I had been living out of 2 suitcases for over 2 years, back to my original home. "You're moving back to that house?" Jennifer asked, the question carrying undertones of genuine concern mixed with residual condescension. "Mom, you know it needs work. The maintenance issues we discussed haven't been resolved. Are you sure you can handle living there alone?" Her worry might have been touching if it hadn't been so tainted by her history of manufacturing concerns to justify her control over my life. But this time, I was prepared with more than just assertions of my competence. I had documentation. "Actually," I said, pulling out a folder of papers I had been saving for this moment, "I had the house professionally inspected 3 weeks ago. The structural issues you described don't exist. The gutters need minor repairs, not replacement. The tree limb you were so worried about was removed by a tree service for $87. The foundation is solid, the electrical system is up to code, and the plumbing works perfectly." I handed her the inspection report, watching as her face went through a complex series of expressions while she read the technical details that contradicted every concern she had raised about the property. The house she had described as a dangerous liability was actually in excellent condition for a structure its age, requiring only routine maintenance that any competent homeowner could manage. "You had it inspected?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had it inspected, repaired, and updated," I continued, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. "I also had the locks changed, the security system upgraded, and a cleaning service restore it to move-in condition. I've been planning this transition for weeks, just like any competent adult would do when making a major life decision." The implications hit Jennifer like a physical blow. Every argument she had made about my declining capabilities, every concern she had raised about my judgment, every suggestion that I needed her management to avoid making dangerous decisions, all of it was being systematically demolished by evidence of careful planning, thorough research, and responsible decision-making. Mark stopped supervising the movers and approached us, clearly sensing that something significant was happening. When Jennifer wordlessly handed him the inspection report, his expressions cycled through confusion, realization, and finally a kind of grudging respect that he seemed reluctant to acknowledge. "You planned all of this," he said, not quite making it a question. "I planned all of this," I confirmed. "The legal strategy, the timing of the eviction, the property inspection, the move back to my house. Every detail was carefully considered and professionally executed by a 71-year-old woman you both believed was too slow and confused to manage her own affairs." The silence that followed was heavy, with the weight of realizations that couldn't be undone. Jennifer and Mark were being forced to confront the possibility that their entire understanding of our family dynamic had been built on assumptions that served their convenience rather than reflecting reality. Sarah, who had been eavesdropping from the front steps, walked over with the kind of direct approach that teenagers sometimes use when adults are being evasive about important truths. "So Grandma was never actually confused or forgetful?" she asked, looking back and forth between her parents and me. "You just thought she was?" Jennifer's attempt to explain was painful to watch. "Sweetheart, it's complicated. Grandma Dorothy was showing signs of… we thought she was having some difficulties with…" "With what?" Sarah pressed, her voice gaining confidence as she sensed her parents' uncertainty. "With cooking? She made great meals. With managing money? She was paying bills for 2 houses. With making decisions? She just evicted you from her own property using a lawyer and a sheriff. What exactly was she having trouble with?" The question hung in the air unanswered, because there was no good answer. Jennifer and Mark had convinced themselves that I needed their management, but when pressed for specific examples of incompetence or confusion, they could only point to the normal pace and preferences of an elderly person who approached decisions with more care and deliberation than their fast-paced lifestyle demanded. Michael joined the conversation with his own observation. "I think the problem was that Grandma moved slower than Mom wanted her to, so Mom decided that meant she was thinking slower too." The insight was devastating in its accuracy. Jennifer had confused the physical realities of aging with cognitive decline, and she had used that confusion to justify taking control of my life in ways that served her need for efficiency and control more than my actual needs for support or assistance. As the last of their belongings disappeared into the moving truck, Jennifer made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of our relationship. "Mom, I know we made mistakes, but I hope someday you can forgive us. I hope we can find a way to be a family again." The request was sincere, but it was also incomplete. Forgiveness couldn't be one-sided. It required acknowledgement of what needed to be forgiven, understanding of why it had been wrong, and commitment to different behavior in the future. Jennifer was asking for absolution without offering accountability. "Forgiveness is possible," I said carefully, "but it has to be built on honesty about what happened, and respect for who I actually am, not who you need me to be to make your decisions feel justified." The moving truck pulled away at exactly 3:47 p.m., carrying with it the last physical evidence of the 2 years I had spent as a tolerated guest in my own house. As I watched it disappear around the corner, I felt a profound sense of completion, not happiness exactly, but the deep satisfaction that comes from reclaiming something that was always rightfully yours. An hour later, my own modest moving crew arrived to transport me back to the house on Maple Street, back to the rooms where Frank and I had built our life together, back to the space where I could once again be the author of my own story, rather than a supporting character in someone else's narrative. The circle was closing, but unlike most circles, this one was leading me forward rather than back to where I had started. 6 months after the eviction papers were served at Jennifer's ill-fated garden party, I sat on the front porch of my Maple Street house, watching the sunrise paint the Kansas sky in shades of rose and gold. The morning air carried the scent of the tulips I had planted in October, a small act of faith that spring would come and find me still here, still independent, still choosing my own path forward. The house had transformed in ways both subtle and profound during my return. What Jennifer had seen as deterioration, I had recognized as the natural settling of a home waiting for its owner to return. The rooms that had felt hollow and echoing during my brief visits now hummed with the quiet contentment of a space being lived in rather than merely maintained. I had made changes that reflected my current needs rather than clinging to the arrangements Frank and I had shared during our marriage. The formal dining room became a crafting space where I worked on quilting projects for the church auction. The guest bedroom was converted into a small library, with comfortable reading chairs positioned to catch the afternoon light. These weren't the accommodations of someone in decline. They were the purposeful adaptations of someone building a life suited to her present circumstances, rather than mourning her past. The neighborhood had welcomed me back with an enthusiasm that surprised me. Mrs. Patterson had organized a small welcome home gathering, complete with casseroles and homemade cookies, that reminded me why I had loved this community for so many years. More importantly, my story had spread beyond Lawrence, inspiring other elderly residents throughout Kansas, who were facing similar pressures from well-meaning but controlling adult children. Margaret Walsh had become a regular visitor and close friend. After witnessing my successful assertion of independence, she had found the courage to resist her son's pressure to sell her house and move to assisted living. Instead, she had hired a part-time caregiver for the specific tasks where she needed assistance while maintaining control over her major life decisions. Our Wednesday afternoon coffee meetings had evolved into informal strategy sessions, where we discussed the challenges of aging with dignity in a society that often equated physical limitations with mental incapacity. "You know what the difference is between us and our children?" Margaret said during one of our conversations, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "We lived through the Depression, World War II, and raised families while working jobs and managing households with a fraction of the conveniences they take for granted. But somehow they think we're the ones who can't handle modern life." Her observation highlighted one of the fundamental misunderstandings that had driven my conflict with Jennifer. My daughter's generation had grown up with technological solutions for every problem, instant communication, and the expectation that everything should move at the speed of digital convenience. When faced with my more deliberate approach to decision-making, they had interpreted patience and thoroughness as confusion and decline. The legal aspects of my situation had resolved themselves with satisfying clarity. Robert Chen kept me informed about Jennifer and Mark's attempts to challenge the eviction through various legal channels, all of which had failed spectacularly. Their lawyers had quickly advised them that pursuing litigation would only result in additional legal fees and further public embarrassment, since my case was legally airtight and morally compelling. More interesting were the broader implications of what had happened. Robert told me that he had received inquiries from elderly clients throughout the region who were dealing with similar family dynamics. My case had become something of a landmark, not in formal legal terms, but as a practical demonstration that elderly people retained both the right and the capability to make major decisions about their own lives, even when those decisions conflicted with their family's preferences. "What you did," Robert explained during one of our follow-up meetings, "was provide a roadmap for other people in similar situations. You showed that being old doesn't mean being powerless, and that family relationships don't automatically grant someone authority over another adult's life." The ripple effects extended into Lawrence's social circles as well. Jennifer and Mark's new living situation had forced them to confront the reality of their actual financial circumstances without the subsidy of living in my house rent-free. The rental property they had found was smaller, located in a less prestigious neighborhood, and consumed a much larger portion of their income. The lifestyle adjustments were difficult, but ultimately healthy. They were finally living within their actual means rather than maintaining appearances they couldn't afford. Sarah had adapted to the changes with remarkable resilience. Her new school was actually a better fit for her academic interests. And the experience of watching her family navigate a genuine crisis had matured her in ways that prosperity and comfort never could have. She had started visiting me monthly, initially awkward encounters that gradually evolved into genuine conversations about family, independence, and the complexity of adult relationships. During one particularly meaningful visit, she asked me a question that revealed how much her perspective had changed. "Grandma, do you think Mom really believed you couldn't take care of yourself? Or did she just find it convenient to believe that?" The question demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how people sometimes convince themselves that their self-serving actions are actually acts of kindness. "I think your mother started with good intentions," I replied carefully, "but those intentions got tangled up with her own needs for control and financial security. Sometimes it's easier to believe someone needs your help than to admit you need theirs." Michael had chosen a different path toward understanding our family's dysfunction. He had started researching elder care and family dynamics for a school project, approaching the subject with the methodical curiosity that reminded me so much of Frank. His findings had led to some uncomfortable conversations with his parents about the difference between appropriate support for elderly family members and inappropriate control over their autonomy. I found all these studies about how infantilizing elderly people actually accelerates cognitive decline, he told me during one of his visits. When you treat someone like they can't make decisions, they start to lose confidence in their ability to make decisions. Mom and Dad were actually creating the problem they thought they were solving. His research had revealed the psychological mechanisms behind what Jennifer had done to me. By consistently questioning my judgment, simplifying my choices, and taking over my responsibilities, she had been undermining the very cognitive engagement that keeps elderly minds sharp and capable. Her help had been precisely the kind of intervention that transforms independent seniors into dependent patients. The most profound change in my life, however, was the relationship I had developed with myself. For 2 years, I had absorbed Jennifer's narrative about my declining capabilities, allowing her assumptions to influence my own self-perception. I had started to question my judgment, second-guess my decisions, and defer to her supposedly superior understanding of what was best for me. Reclaiming my independence had required more than just legal action. It had demanded that I reject the diminished version of myself that Jennifer needed me to be and embrace the competent, capable woman I had always been. At 71, I was discovering aspects of my personality that had been suppressed by decades of putting others' needs before my own. I had enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community college, something Frank had always dismissed as frivolous, but I had secretly wanted to try. I had joined a hiking group for seniors, rediscovering the joy of physical activity without someone monitoring my pace or questioning my stamina. I had even started traveling, taking day trips to museums and historical sites that interested me without having to consider anyone else's preferences or schedule. These weren't the activities of someone in decline. They were the pursuits of someone finally free to explore her own interests after a lifetime of supporting others' dreams. The relationship with Jennifer remained complicated and fragile. We spoke occasionally by phone, conversations that were polite but careful, circling around the fundamental issues that had led to our estrangement. She had never fully acknowledged the harm her actions had caused, preferring to characterize our conflict as a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand, rather than a systematic violation of my autonomy and dignity. But forgiveness, I had learned, didn't require the other person's acknowledgement or apology. It simply required my own decision to stop carrying their mistakes as a burden on my future. I had forgiven Jennifer not because she deserved it, but because I deserved the peace that comes from letting go of resentment. As I sat on my porch that morning watching my neighborhood wake up around me, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me back to where I started. The house was the same, but I was different, stronger, clearer about my worth, less willing to compromise my dignity for the sake of keeping peace with people who didn't respect me. At 71, I had learned that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to demand the respect you deserve, and never too late to choose independence over security when that security comes at the cost of your autonomy. I had learned that being called a burden by someone who was actually dependent on your generosity says nothing about your worth and everything about their character. Most importantly, I had learned that eviction papers aren't just legal documents. They're declarations of independence, statements of self-worth, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who have forgotten how to treat you with dignity. The sun was fully up now, painting the world in the clear, honest light of a new day. I had work to do, places to go, decisions to make, all of them my own. All of them chosen freely by a woman who had finally remembered that she was nobody's burden and everyone's equal. Dorothy Henderson was home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.